Welcome to Richborough Estates and Landmark Chambers webinar on Planning for the Future, the government's white paper on planning reform. Reform that the Prime Minister states in the foreword is a radical reform unlike anything we've seen since the Second World War. So that's quite a claim. We're delighted to see so many of you joining us, and we hope that you'll find the presentations and the discussions to be useful and informative. There have been a number of excellent webinars hosted by others in recent weeks that have been more focused to the professionals, those that are more familiar with the planning system. So we're going to take a little bit more of a look at what the proposed reforms mean to landowners and promoters in a practical sense. Hopefully it will help you understand a little more about the paper, and we'll share our initial thoughts on how radical it actually is. For those of you that don't know, my name is Paul Campbell. I'm Chief Exec of Richborough Estates, and I'll chair today's session. I'll be joined by Zack Simons of Landmark, James Bradshaw, Charlotte Lewis, Dean Knight, and Haydn Jones of Richborough, and I'll be formally introducing them in a short while. To begin with though, just a few housekeeping points to note. As normal on these things, your microphones are automatically muted, and you'll not need to adjust anything. The same goes for your camera. We very much welcome questions throughout the session. There'll be an ability to submit those via text in the Q&A section, which you'll find on the top or the bottom of your screen. We'll be keeping an eye on those as they come through. We'll endeavour to answer as many of those as possible. If we don't get to those, then we'll try and follow up with any questions, any answers rather, in due course. The webinar is going to be recorded, and so you'll receive a link afterwards. And if you want to share that with colleagues, that's absolutely fine. If you're recording, if your connection's lost at any point, then all you've got to do is click onto the same link and you should be back into the forum. So let us begin. The long-awaited planning paper was issued on the 6th of August, and it's open for consultation until the 29th of October. The format today is that we're going to listen to Zack give us an initial overview of the reforms, just hear how radical or not they are, how it might compare to the current system, and then we're going to explore with Zack and the other panelists just some of the practical consequences and some of the threats and opportunities that it might present to the promotion of land. For those of you that don't know much about Richborough Estates, we specialise in promotion of residential land. So today's session is going to be unashamedly about residential. We've been promoting land for nearly 17 years now, and we're based in the centre of Birmingham, presence in London. We have over 100 sites nationally, ranging from as far north as Harrogate and as far south as Poole. Our raison d'etre is to obtain residential planning permissions, as you might expect, and to maximise the efficiency of those sites using our specialist design, technical, commercial and planning skills before appointing development partners, i.e. house builders. It's a risky and expensive game, and what's at stake for our landowner partners is significant. Our landowners do include a range of types. There are individuals, charities, family trusts, corporates, and even local government organisations on occasion. They put an awful lot of faith in us as promoters to navigate what's an extremely complex and sometimes unpredictable, often unpredictable planning system. So without further ado, I'll introduce the panellists. Zack Simons, who's one of the most highly rated junior planning barristers in the country. His modesty won't allow him to say this himself, but he's been described as a who's who legal, as being simply brilliant, and by Planning Magazine as a real rising star. I'd just like to do a quick plug of his excellent planning blog called Planner Acts, which I definitely recommend you subscribe to. It's always on the money, and yeah, definitely log into that. We're very, very lucky to have him, and I'm looking forward to his insightful thoughts. Also joining us, the 4 colleagues from Richborough Estates. Firstly, Charlotte, who's our design director. Charlotte's a chartered architect and urban designer, which is responsible for the design of all of Richborough schemes, and she was recently appointed to the design review panel, in providing impartial expert advice to applicants and local authorities on design issues. With design seemingly being elevated by government and very prevalent in the paper, I'm looking forward to hearing her thoughts on the reforms. Also joining us is Dean Knight, who's our technical director and responsible for all pre and post planning technical aspects of Richborough schemes. We'll talk about automatic permissions and allocation in local plans. I'm particularly interested in hearing what it could mean in practice and how we can continue to de-risk our sites before appointing development partners. Our planning director, Haydn Jones, is also joining us, and will hopefully bring some insight on what changes might mean on a practical level on just how allocations and permissions are secured going forward. And finally, last but not least, James Bradshaw's also with us. James is our Managing Director of Eastern Division and is responsible for over 50 of our sites, ranging from 50 unit schemes right up to large SUEs over 1,000 dwellings. James was formerly responsible for Taylor Wimpey's strategic land business in the West Midlands, and I'm looking forward to his thoughts on what the planning reforms might mean on how lands promoted going forward. So the intention this afternoon is to try and look past the media headlines, of which there's been many, been on all over the pages and the airwaves, and we're going to consider what the possible changes might mean. The government are certainly not the first, and they won't be the last to reach the conclusion that the planning system is a brake to economic growth. And it felt inevitable with a new government and facing a recession of a certain magnitude that we were going to be facing with some radical reform. But how true is it that the planning system is a brake to economic growth? Is it just a teeny bit risky that too many changes by government might just make it more complicated and actually cause unintended delays? We've been here before, after all, on lots of different reforms. But despite the apparent watering down of the government's commitment to house building in the Conservative manifesto, which seemed to drop the 300,000 houses requirement, it does seem that that 300,000 is very much back on the cards. It features all the way through the minister's briefings and through the paper. And so we're going to examine a little closer as to what that might actually mean. But before we do that, it's probably worth giving some clarity on what actually is being consulted on at the moment. Firstly, there's the Planning for the Future white paper. That is the predominant focus of today's session. It is the future planning system. It's been trailed as a 3-tier land zoning system of growth, renewal and restraint. So that's some new jargon to get ourselves used to. But accompanying that were 2 other important consultation papers, which are very important to understanding context of what we're going to be talking about today. Firstly, it's the changes to the current planning system. That does what it says on the tin. It's going to be looking at the more immediate changes. It covers 4 topics, which are, firstly, the review of the standardised housing methodology. So that's caused a great deal of the media coverage in recent weeks. And we'll be spending a little time just to wrestle with that and what it translates through into the actual future system as well. Secondly, it's the implementation of the government's First Home Initiative, which is long been trailed. We can talk about that a little bit more if we have time. There's thirdly, some measures in there to assist the small and medium-sized builders. Think of it more of an economic stimulus where they're looking at reducing affordable thresholds for a certain period of time to give a bit of a boost to the market. Fourthly, it's the extension of the permission in principle. So there's plenty there, impactful stuff, but that consultation deadline is the 1st of October, so nearly a month sooner than the future. Secondly, there is other consultation on the transparency and competition, a call for evidence on data of land control. That's effectively a push to try and open up the alleged opaqueness on who owns land, who controls it under options and preemptions. That consultation deadline is the 30th of October. We're not going to talk about that at all today, but it was just something to alert you to. And also, we just need to anticipate something else coming along, which is going to be very important as well. It's the government's looking to publish a devolution and local recovery white paper in the autumn. Ministers are signalling that they have definitely local government reorganisation on the cards. And we've seen a little bit of detail of that last week when PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, have undertaken a study for the County Councils network, where they seem to conclude that the abolition of 213 district councils and replacing them with just 25 unitary authorities. Now, the obvious purpose of that is to save money and to get better strategic planning. So very, very important, and we will come back to that later. It's going to be hard to understand, what we're primarily what we're talking about today without all of that context. And while we're not going to have time to cover it all, we will try and join some of the dots up as we go through, so you can understand just how it hangs together. A word of warning though, it's very much a government consultation, and upon reading the documents, then it certainly does lead to as many questions as it does answers, as you might expect. And so beware, we might not be able to demystify it perfectly, but we're going to give it a good go. It's fair to say that the planning system, no one would argue, is complex, but the reforms are characteristically complex too. But Zack has the skill of making the complex seem a little simpler. I'm going to ask you, Zack, to have the unenviable task of trying to wade your way through that. And Zack, we're particularly interested in, what does the future hold in this brave new world? How does it compare to the current system? Is it as radical as it's trailed? So over to you, Zach, really.
Thanks so much, Paul, for that lovely introduction, and of course, most important, for the shameless but very welcome plug for PlannerActs.com. I'm delighted to be joining you and the other esteemed Richborough folk on this panel. So much to talk about. Where on earth do we start? What I'll try to do is for just 10 minutes to give you some headlines on three of the most important topics that we all need to know about. And those are: first, the proposed new national housing plan; second, the idea for local plans; and third, how planning decisions would actually work in this brave new world. So first, the housing plan. For almost a decade now, it's been down to local planning authorities to fix their own housing targets through local plans. Well, hasn't always worked out so well. So the big idea in the white paper, and I think this really is a radical idea, is for central government to take back control, to coin a phrase, of housing numbers. Hang on, you might be thinking, haven't we already got a standard method for dealing with housing need already? Well, no, not one like this. The standard method that we've already got and that's being consulted on at the moment sets a statistically derived starting point for each local authority, but it doesn't layer on constraints, the Greenbelt, AOMB, and all the rest, which means that local authorities are entitled not to plan to meet that number. And of course, regularly, they don't. What's on offer in the white paper is very different. New, centrally set, binding housing targets fixed for each local planning authority, which have already baked in the constraints. And the authority's job is then to meet their number through a new round of local plans that I'll touch on just in a moment. And taken together, you alluded to it, Paul, the various figures add up to the government's 300,000 annual new homes target. That's the idea. What's the prize? Plan examinations, planning applications and appeals with no debates at all about housing numbers. Sounds good. What are the challenges? They're massive. We've got the substantive challenge. How will targets actually be calculated? How are the sort of relativities between different kinds of constraints actually to be computed? Who does that maths? Who makes the judgment calls on how to reflect these different constraints and the all important decisions on what goes where? And then more daunting still, I think, is how is all of this going to work procedurally? Because whatever the outcome is of this national exercise, it's going to be just a little bit controversial in more or less every quarter of the planning system. And given that allocations in this new system can add up to outline planning permission, come back to that in a minute, the implications of these new housing numbers are enormous, which means there'll have to be a forum of some kind or another to consider and adjudicate somehow on where England's housing should actually go, and designing a forum that's streamlined enough to meet the demands of the white paper to get things cracking, speed up, whilst also being fair and democratically accountable. Ain't going to be easy. How is all of that going to work? Well, the white paper doesn't tell us anything about any of that. But in any event, top-down, centrally fixed targets for each authority, which account for constraints. That's the big new idea for housing numbers. And I think, Paul, as I've said, that actually is a radical change from how things work at the moment. But it takes us to plan making. So on to plan making, let's just note the things that haven't changed. Quite a bit. The fundamental structure of the English planning system, for one thing. We've still got local planning authorities. We've still got them adopting local plans that guide development in accordance with an overriding NPPF, National Planning Policy Framework. So what's new? A statutory test for plans to meet at sped up local plan examinations of sustainable development, because we're told that term is well understood by everyone. Not by me, but hopefully by all of you. The new NPPF will contain national development management policies. And again, in my book, that's a good idea to avoid the sort of repetition in these sorts of policies that you tend to find across plans all over the country. So what's left for local plans to do? Well, zoning, sort of. They'll have to carve up all land in England into three different areas, and the growth, renewal and protection. Growth is an area for, quote, substantial development, which is one of those really important terms that will be defined in the new NPPF and then fought over for years. But it includes new settlements, urban extensions, areas for redevelopment like former industrial sites or urban regen sites. And it excludes land with, quote, important constraints. What do they mean? No idea. White paper doesn't tell us. And areas of high flood risk. The new local plan will map these growth areas and any sub-areas within the growth area. It adds in a key for permitted uses within the area, sets out limitations on height, on density. Particular sub-areas that are picked out for mention in the white paper include high-density housing, high streets, town centres, self and custom build homes, community-led housing developments. I'll come back to growth areas in a minute, because the magic about the growth area is once your site's in one, you get what the government have been calling an automatic grant of planning permission. Sounds good? Hold fire. Next, renewal areas. Again, local plans will map these, set out acceptable uses, heights and densities for new development within them. And then there's a new statutory presumption in favour of permitting applications for those specified uses, which we're told will emphasise the plan-led approach. And then finally, protect areas. And here we protect Greenbelt. And note, by the way, there's not a scintilla of reform on offer for planning in the Greenbelt. There we are. AOMBs, local wildlife sites, deemed open countryside outside settlement boundaries, lots of other things, including conservation areas. Plus, something I think Charlotte's going to come back to, we're on for new design codes, either as part of the local plan or as an SPD or as potentially as part of a neighbourhood plan. How are all these plans made? Well, quickly, the idea is a new sped up 30-month end-to-end process. And the government thinks that pretty ambitious timetable might just be achievable because, remember, under this new vision, there's no need to wrangle about housing numbers at the examination, no need to talk about development management policies, all that stuff centralised. We'll see. Resourcing the system properly to achieve a whole new generation of plan making in just a few years is going to be a challenge of considerable scale, but I'll come back to one of the implications of the streamlined process in a moment. So that's a new era of local plan making and the 3 zones. What about decision taking? Again, let's just start with what hasn't changed. Lots. We still need planning permission for new development. We still, sometimes anyway, need to get it through discretionary decisions on whether or not to grant permission in line with the development plan and other material considerations. So far, so familiar. How would we actually get planning permission in this brave new world? Well, taking it zone by zone. First, growth areas. And as I've said, adopting the new local plan equals automatic outline planning permission or permission in principle within those use, height, density parameters. Now, the permission might be automatic, but it's not unconditional. And as I said, each growth area goes along with a master plan, design codes, which might be site specific. There might be authority wide too, or area wide. The automatic permission is conditional on complying with all that stuff. And we don't yet know when, how, or in what way these documents may actually come forward. To get from your outline permission or your permission in principle to a full permission that you can actually build, the white paper suggests 3 routes in the growth areas. It could be a reserved matters approval, which we're familiar with, broadly speaking. Could be a local development order, which is something authorities can already do, but don't do very often. And for exceptionally large sites, so we're talking many thousands of homes or a new settlement, DCOs, Development Consent Order under the NSIP regime and the Planning Act 2008. But here's the rub. What's being allocated in a growth area, what it actually means for you and your site, how valuable the automatic permission actually is, how close it gets you to being able to crack on and get building. All of that stuff could vary enormously from plan to plan and from place to place, even within a single plan area. And I think there's a bit of a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, you might find your site in a growth area, subject only to height, density or use parameters. Celebration time? Maybe, because it leaves you with a huge amount of work to do on master planning, layout, design, infrastructure, and all the other reserved matters before you've got a consent you can actually build. Somewhere in the middle of the spectrum may be an allocation with those same parameters, but layered over with a master plan or a design code, which may or may not form part of the plan, but in any event will give you some more guidance on what's likely to be acceptable, but may themselves cause some headaches, which generate a bit of cost and delay. At the other end of the spectrum, you may have an allocation bolstered by a local development order, say, with a scheme-specific master plan, which would maximise your certainty, would maximise, we'd like to think anyway, ease of delivery, at the cost perhaps of some flexibility. Because what happens if your master plan forms part of the adopted local plan, and for whatever reason, things have to change? You can't apply to vary a plan policy, can you? Not at the moment, anyway. So is it back to the drawing board with a fresh planning application? We don't know. So lots of opportunities, but also really very difficult questions about how growth areas are actually going to work. The other two areas to think about: renewal areas, a bit easier. Consent can be granted in a renewal area through permission in principle, or a full planning application, or a local development order, which is pretty similar to the situation that we've got at the moment. All of that stuff bolstered by that statutory presumption in favour of permission for uses which are specified in the plan and which meet the design codes. And finally, in protect areas, you need a planning application, same as now. Query how much lumping together Greenbelt, AONB, and all the other designations together with general open countryside might actually make life more, not less difficult than it is already, trying to promote those all-important edge of settlement sites for housing, something perhaps we can come back to. Even in growth areas and renewal areas, you can bring forward schemes which are different to the plan through a full planning application, same as now. But the idea seems to be that because of this legally bolstered plan-led approach that I referred to, that'll tend to make those applications a bit more of an uphill battle. So finally, one big implication, and I mean, again, there are so many, where do you even start? But one big implication that strikes me from all of this, I think it's something that Haydn's going to touch on later on in more detail, but just at a high level, the importance of front loading. Because of course, getting yourself allocated through the local plan process is already a really important part of trying to promote sites for residential development. But it's about to get mission critical, engaging fully, no holds barred, with the plan making process will be literally more important now than it ever has been before. Every site being put forward for allocation in a growth area is more or less making an outline planning application. So it's going to become incredibly important to get this stuff right, and to get it right early. And the pressure's compounded by the new streamlined local plan process that I talked about a few minutes ago. No call for sites consultation, then Reg 18, then Reg 19. No, you get one go to draft those reps that might just get your site into a plan. That's it. And then if you're lucky, you get one chance to persuade an inspector why the authority got it right or got it wrong. But you better get your site into the plan first time around, because with the trimmed down timetable for adoption, there ain't going to be much time for major revisions during the examination itself. And remember, as I've said already, if you're in the game of housing delivery, as many on this webinar will be, your work needs to start well before the local plan process, because that's when the ministry starts producing the national housing plan I was talking about earlier, where some incredibly important decisions are going to be made. I could go on all afternoon, but I suspect that's probably enough. I hope that at least, Paul, introduces everyone to the three of the big headline items. But back to you.
That's very clear, or at least as clear as anyone could make all of this. This isn't tinkering, is it? I mean, this is some serious reforms, really. So, I mean, you've set up a number of themes there that I want to pick up with the guys later on. But I think before we do move on, I think it's just an interesting journey that the government's gone on with housing numbers, because it felt only a bit of nostalgia thinking about Eric Pickles and talking about, abolishing the regional strategies. And in fact, he wanted to stop you from having Maseratis all you lot, didn't he, the barristers? So,
it's absolutely astonishing. The cheek of it, unbelievable.
But I just find it fascinating that they went from saying that the regional strategies were a very dictatorial kind of top-down approach, absolutely local, and that the direction of travel that we are going in, admittedly consultation, but if we take that consultation as being the signposting where the destination we end up at, we're going to be talking about something even more centrally controlled.
Absolutely, it's more than Back to the Future. This would be much more top-down, Soviet tractor style approach to housing numbers than the regional strategies that Eric Pickles abolished in 2010. And for a good example of where the bubbling tensions are starting to simmer. Have a look at what Chris Pincher, the minister, said a week or two ago. He had to come out to try to quell the revolting Conservative MPs and local councillors in the shires by saying that the government's standard method is only a starting figure, not the final answer for housing numbers, which will all be left to local planning authorities. Don't worry, everyone. And of course, that's right, so far as the current system goes, but it completely misrepresents the picture under the new white paper. And, if he doesn't like centrally imposed housing numbers, imagine what he'll think when he reads the white paper.
Absolutely. And when you mention baking in the constraints at a national level, I mean, the mind boggles as to how you can do that without examination of plans, because one person is a bit overblown than another person's. But you haven't really got much flex, because we're talking about the new standardised number being consulted on in the other paper aggregates to 337,000 homes nationally. If we want to get to a national target of 300,000, that's less than 10% flex to deal with any constraints. We've got some very serious.
I agree.
We've got national park, we've got flooding, we've got triple SI, we've got all of those kind of things before you get onto the political football of.
I couldn't agree more. And if you want to see this visually, that the problem with not having that flex that you're talking about, have a look at the tables that show where the new proposed revisions to the standardised method put new houses.
Yeah.
Which is, predominantly in London, the southeast. That London in particular is, marked out for very substantial levels of growth. And then have that on one side of your table. On the other side, have a look at, the map of the metropolitan greenbelt and the AONBs that surround London and the southeast. It's one of the most heavily constrained areas in the country. It's exactly the same as one of the areas that really, is picked out for the greatest levels of housing growth. So that second step of getting from your standardised figure, whatever that might be, to your policy on constraints-based figure is so important. You almost can't think of anything more controversial. And as I say, Paul, I agree with you. We don't yet know what the forum, procedure, inquiry, who knows, what that's going to look like.
Yeah, we'll move on now. But the last thing I'd probably say on the numbers is that it doesn't appear to be much levelling up in there as well, really. We've got a huge amount of London which have never been able to meet those numbers. And yet a fairly muted kind of increase in the north when you've got...
It's unfortunately, Paul, it's worse than a muted increase in some areas of the north, particularly the northeast. Yeah. And it is, I must say, a bit of a disappointment to lots of us that the proposed formula actually reduces targets in lots of areas of the north and the northeast against historic delivery. So they're being told slow down rather than speed up, which is how that fits with the sort of levelling up agenda is quite difficult to get your head around.
Right, so plenty to fall over, really. So I'm going to move on. I mean, all this upfront, evidence and short-term plan making. It's planning euphoria, really. I mean, what's not to like about that? We want to get our allocations quickly. We want to get out of them, build them quickly. But it just seems a little bit unrealistic to imagine all of that work happening up front in a relatively constrained period of time. And I just wondered, Haydn, whether or not, you've promoted sites for Richborough in numerous local plan examinations. Just the level of information that might be being, involved in that, and the time that examinations actually tend to spend on allocations. I mean, what are your thoughts on how it might all work?
Paul, at the moment, the level of scrutiny on individual sites and examinations depends on lots of things. Often it's public interest that the site gets, lots of the local residents turn up. Sometimes it's when small authorities allocated some large sites or complex sites, I might get a lot of focus. But in the main, I think, inspectors can get through quite a few sites in their sessions, in the current examinations, although different inspectors are different. The changes proposed, as Zack has highlighted, could bring a lot more actors into the local plan process. At the moment, in a planning application, we routinely consult with highways authorities, ecology officers, the Environment Agency, environmental health, landscape. Sometimes it's natural England or historic England. Now imagine all those getting involved in the detail of a site at the local plan stage and trying to, get to that stage if we genuinely believe that an outline permission will mirror anything like we've got now. Now, multiply that by 10 allocations or 20 allocations or 30 allocations, that's a lot of time and effort. And if it ended up at examination that way, a lot of examination time. Now, I'm sure the government will say, well, all that will be ironed out beforehand. Don't worry, when it gets to examination, the inspector will take it all as read, it'll all be fine. But don't forget that the government have given local authorities 30 months in total, but 18 months really from a standing start to get your plan to an examination. And there's of those 18 months, probably only about 12 months will be the actual trying to work out what the allocations are, because the previous 6 involves a call for sites in the first place. And a lot of people say, well, a year's fine, but I think we all know that a year in planning is not very long at all. And the further thing might be that some sites might get ironed out before examination, but if a consultee isn't happy with what a local authority is proposing, the Environment Agency, for example, is the examination the last sort of opportunity for them to get in front of an inspector and say, this isn't working, this isn't right? And that could take a lot of time examination. Although we do know that the white paper suggests that inspectors might not do face-to-face all the time, they could do phone calls or virtual, so that might happen. To date, and I think going forward, the most time taken examination will involve those sites where there's a lot of public interest. They're the ones that probably get a lot of scrutiny. Now that's relevant because the white paper suggesting, well, this is the forum for local people to get involved in planning. This is where local people need to be now. They're not going to see so many notices on lampposts any longer. It's the local plan, and that itself, can take quite a lot of time up in preparation and examination.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, that's before we even start talking about the resources of local authorities at the moment to deal with planning applications. I mean, we're almost talking about 20, 30, however many allocations there are, equivalent of applications all on day one, when they would normally be dealing with that over a planned period to a degree. Yeah. I mean, the level of information and scrutiny on certain sites, but it can be light touch at the moment. So I definitely think there's a challenge there. Of course, it could even get more difficult because if we do go to the unitary route, I mean, I know there are some unitaries across the country already, but 213 district councils into 25 odd unitaries, then we could be talking about plans with numerous allocations, well over 100 allocations. So just probably amplifies the issue there. I think the problem that I'm hearing from that though is that we're almost promoting in the dark a little bit. We're putting our sites forward. We're having to put that level of investment and work up front. But you don't have the benefit that we have at the moment of seeing how that plan evolves and what strategy are you actually promoting it against. Does your site fit in with that strategy? Are you having to have a go at the plan because that's the only way you can get your site in? In knowing what the context is of the plan, you can then look at the runners and riders and see who your competition is, and you scale your investment accordingly, don't you? Really. So it seems, I mean, if you took, I mean, obviously from an individual and a business point of view, it could be burdensome. But if you expected the entire landowning community and promoters and developers to roll their sleeves up and be ready for that level of action, then it's an enormous, almost unsustainable investment, really. But let's imagine that it happens. Then we are talking, just to get this clear, almost a planning application level of information, Haydn.
Yeah, absolutely. Zack's already talked about the spectrum that we might have from the permission in principle through to an outline. But most landowners would probably be more interested in the growth areas and the renewal areas. And the white paper does say that land identified within growth areas will automatically be granted outline planning. But then there is this question about how interchangeable are the authors with outline and permission in principle. Is it the same thing or isn't it? We don't know. But if you take it on face value, outline planning, at the moment, an outline application, we need to get involved in lots of technical work. highways, drainage, ground conditions. Absolutely. One of the big things we all know is highways. So, does the local highway network work? That's probably a valid question, isn't it? And as Zach said, design is going to be incredibly important again in the future. So that's another added element to it. I previously talked about the 18-month window, and the government are proposing the first 6 months. They're calling that the plan shaping stage. So that sounds quite important. You get the opportunity to submit your sites into that. And I think really that the detail of what you submit at that stage could make or break a site. And I think there's probably two reasons for this, or at least two reasons. Firstly, planning officers, they'll be under significant time and resource pressures to assess sites. The keys there provide all the evidence to support the site. And you might find a situation where, an average site that's supported by robust evidence, put together by a promoter, elevates itself above a good site that's got no evidence behind it, and purely because that makes somebody's life somewhere else a bit easier. Secondly, again, we've mentioned this before, but the opportunity to make multiple submissions in the plan making process, they're going. After the call for sites, the next opportunity is that make the reps examination in front of the inspector there. So, there could be an opportunity there, perhaps if you've got an allocation already, or, the council think you're going to get an allocation. Perhaps they might ask you some questions and bolster your material. But in the main, you've got two shots at it, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on the opportunity side of things, just to try and look with a glass half full, getting a lot of this information dealt with up front, if it's possible, the resource it, then it'd be a nice place to be, wouldn't it? To be getting it, at that stage, to have dealt with so much, you're taking it part way on the journey, more probably along the journey than you would do on a normal allocation right now. My questions is what happens later on, and we'll come on to some of those later on. But I think what probably you have got to worry about as well is that just whether or not you run the risk of washing your dirty laundry in public sometimes. You put these sites under scrutiny, and we all promote, we pick good sites, lots of our competitors pick good sites, but no one has a perfect site. And the more that you put it under a light, then the more that you can find issues with it. I think the beauty sometimes of going through the allocations as we know it now is that you leave some of the wrangling, a little bit later on, but you do it with the benefit of an allocation under your belt with a more proactive kind of attitude to it. So I don't suggest that we debate that now, but I just leave that there as a thought. You mentioned design as well, Haydn. That's all got to be considered up front. It's certainly become much more of a theme of late. We all go to numerous different planning seminars and keynote speakers from ministers and so on. And the last couple of years, they've been talking about we must build more beautifully, and the reason why we've got NIMBYs and not YIMBYs is because we're just simply not putting the right product out there. So the theme was built and built and built, and that shows through in the paper that we're discussing today. So I just wanted to bring you in, Charlotte. Really, we've got this is good for you, in your profession, and you're all about good design. There was a report, Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission earlier in the year. I just wondered whether or not you could give a little bit of an explanation behind that and where we're heading and what it means, really.
Yeah, certainly there's been a lot of talk about the way we design and build new places, and I think that's principally because all too often what's being built is regarded as low quality, and I think sometimes even ugly. And our developments don't always speak to the special characteristics which set apart our cities and our villages and towns in the ways that they could. And additionally, nature and people, those spaces aren't as good as they could be. But it's important, I think, to remember that it's not all negative. We are creating some fantastic places, and strategic schemes are playing a real part of their success and their delivery. So going to put things into context, the National Design Guide was published at the end of last year, and it illustrated just how good design can be achieved in practice. And so it outlined the government's priorities in terms of creating places that were well designed, enduring and beautiful. And now this guide is the current starting point for designers, local communities and local authorities. But as you mentioned, the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, it's always very difficult to say. Their report was called Living with Beauty, sorry. And it was released in the early part of this year, and it just captured how some of the deficiencies are in the way that we design and manage, engage on placemaking. And so with the overarching aim of asking for beauty, refusing ugliness, and promoting stewardships, this report put forward a series of recommendations as to how these deficiencies might just be overcome. And so some of these suggestions were that we should create new places rather than just just homes and houses. And those places should really enhance our environments. They should foster strong community spirits, and they should establish healthy neighbourhoods. It suggested that we should better integrate ecology into the new places that we live and work, making sure that water and landscape are really meaningful parts of them. And then it also suggested that we should maybe change the ways in which we involve local communities in placemaking, and that how we should really make more of the digital technologies that are available to us today to make the planning and design process a much more collaborative and positive one. And so these recommendations very much flow into the new white paper, for which design plays a huge part. And I think there are probably three notable proposals. The first is a new model, national model design code. Now this is intended to be almost like a supplement to the design guide that I've just explained. Plus we can expect to see a revised manual for streets guidance as well. Now the code is probably going to describe the detailed parameters for developments that might be located in different locations, for example, cities, towns and villages. But it might also prescribe what sort of street types we should be providing, the hierarchy of public open spaces, for example, just what makes for successful parking, and also how our places and buildings might address climate change. So in effect, what we will have is a new two-tier approach to design, and that will aid designers, but also decision makers, in understanding just what makes for good design and quality. And I think this is a really important element if quality is to be rewarded by fast-track decision making.
Yeah, sure. Okay. And when will, I mean, if it's obviously a big fundamental point, when are we going to see it? When's the model design going to come out?
Imminently, I think, Paul. It says autumn 2020. And so I don't think it sounds as though the government has any plans for a consultation on this document. So it's likely that its impact will be immediate. And so I think unless an authority has an up-to-date design guide, an SBD, or a site-specific design code, then this new code, this national code and the national guide for design will be the almost like default go-to documents for all types of developments, including strategic proposals. So I guess I'll move on to the next proposition from the white paper, which talks about how local design guides and codes should have more of a binding role on decisions about development. Now, we've been using design coding for quite a few of our projects over recent years, and I think they've proven to be really effective ways of capturing the ingredients about a proposal which makes for good places that work locally. And I think this is especially important when a landowner has a particular legacy at heart, for example. So I think we can expect to see local authorities, neighbourhood planning groups, applicants all creating guides and codes for significant areas of development with effectively good, meaningful input from local communities.
I mean, when we talk about, we hear references about being popular and you know, beauty's in the eye of the beholder and so on. I can see a little bit of tension there as to who adjudicates that type of thing.
Agree.
And, and it begs the question as well that are we looking to not level up in the way we talked about earlier in economic sense, but are we looking to try and raise everybody to the same level? So, at the moment we have quite a a variety of different developers with different models. Some focusing on price points, some focusing on the design. We have got that healthy choice if you want to go out to buy a house at the moment. And the house builders defending their product. There's some fantastic schemes out there that win design awards from national builders and local builders. So we can't caricature any particular developer for any particular style at all, but it could lead to potentially a more narrowing of the business model, really, if we're all expected to kind of is it going to be as much as the cookie cutter out? We're going to be seeing everybody building the same thing, or?
I think what it's trying to do, Paul, it's just trying to establish a benchmark for quality, and I think it's for designers to then use their coding to then sort of use that to look at how we can address locally distinctive design. So it's not forcing anyone down a particular route. I think it's just setting a hallmark for quality. But I don't think we should underestimate the time and skill that's going to be required to prepare a code, because I think clearly there's a huge amount of work ahead for planning authorities and designers. And I think we will probably end up seeing lots of different types of codes being prepared, perhaps depending on the different requirements of an authority, the type, size of a project. So it might not be, as you say, a level playing field. But either way, whatever format a code takes, I think what's really important to say is that it must capture the vision about what a new place is aspiring to be, but also do, because otherwise we will simply default to what we build now. And I do wonder also if coding might prompt local authorities just to reconsider their approach to design standardisation, because sometimes issues such as parking requirements and minimum dwelling sizes and garden sizes, I think if we provide designers with more flexibility, and if local authorities take a more positive approach to the issues of density and intensification of density through coding, then I think that has the capacity to help us expand the style and type of housing, which I think will then in turn help with the way that new homes are almost absorbed into the housing market, and help with the issue of affordability too.
Sure. I mean, I think the key to getting it right is to be market facing, isn't it? Because
it is.
We're in the game of providing consented land to house builders. Our sector now, we provide 50% of the permissions, and the beauty of what we do currently at an outline stage with the design code, maybe with a master plan, is we're de-risking it effectively. We're enabling a builder to take it off us and with some predictability, know how to take it forward and to take it forward pretty quickly. That's important for their business model. They rely on a regular, hopper of consented land from the likes of us. But I'm just wondering, probably move it on to Dean really, is to make sure that we actually get that right, because we've seen plenty of examples where design codes have been led more by a local authority or perhaps a more passive landowner or promoter, where what's been baked into the design code had been a lot of inefficiencies, or it doesn't even work. You simply can't deliver it, certainly deliver it while maintaining any decent value at all. So it is very, very difficult. I mean, the experience that we've had on a couple of large schemes at the moment has proven it's a tightrope to walk between getting the buy-in from the local authority and not conceding to so much that it becomes a bespoke scheme. But it's probably more than that, because a lot of people just think design is the pretty stuff on the surface, that it all just magically gets there. But it's easy to get the actual technical work that underpin all of that wrong. And it's our job to get it right, to make sure that we maximise the asset. But Dean, I mean, I wonder what your thoughts are really on how you bake those right things in.
Well, I mean, with any potential development, I suppose it's an easy assumption to determine a site is suitable purely from a map or a red line plan. So with that view, any development may seem suitable in a technically desirable location near schools, facilities, community infrastructure, etc., with a presumption that those places are perfect. There are almost endless list of difficulties, I suppose, that may reduce the scale and deliverability of any site coming forward, which we personally seek to review and identify at the earliest opportunity, long before we ever put pen to paper on the creation of a master plan, for example. As Haydn had previously mentioned, highways are an important part to be considered, although in some instances it may not affect a master plan. There are a number of developments where that wouldn't be the case. Would a road widening proposal be required? Would a new roundabout need to be installed, or is there a need to introduce additional space on a development for a new bus service, for example? All items that need to be considered. I mean, additionally, accessibility, both legal and physical, utilities, drainage, ecology, ground conditions, levels, and everything in between, all have a part to play in what we work on to deliver our sites. I mean, the location of badger sets or the protected species, TPOs, ancient woodlands, all have a decisive impact on any development site, and we need careful consideration, I suppose, to prevent any abortive work and importantly, the potential for objectors during the process highlighting something that may not have been considered when the site is being promoted through local plans, which could well be the tipping point for a competing site being allocated instead. With regards to accessibility, there may, for example, be a suitably sized highway along one boundary of the developments, which could be perfect as an access. But in some instances, without due consideration, there may be a physical or legal constraint that renders that access less than ideal. It could be the location of a protected tree or underground sewer or unregistered sliver of land. With the mapping system proposed, it may well only consider, say, a 2D view of a site. So should a master plan come forward without proper consideration, you could well end up with a principle of development that one couldn't be delivered, but could introduce extensive cut and fill or retaining features within the gardens. These kinds of issues could significantly constrain a development suitability if, for example, it's then found that you'd need a large retaining wall, particularly with the government's recent consultation on the tightening up of the minimum set in Part M of the building regs. Would that be acceptable at the next planning stage? Would the reduced garden space be suitable, or could that type of approach comply with the design code previously approved? Before determining the form and function of a development and the creation of a master plan and design code, and in some instances before we ever determine a site's going to be pushed forward for this local plan, we would prepare a detailed technical report, constraints plans and boundary reviews on the intended site, all aids in our arsenal, I suppose, of preparing a detailed pack of information to ensure the ongoing detailed designs can be prepared swiftly. It's likely that the competition to becoming allocated in the new proposals will remain, if not exceed, the levels that they are at the moment. So it's more important than ever, I suppose, to ensure that what is proposed can be built. Yeah,
I suppose, I mean, time marching on, so we're going to have to try and get through some of these topics. But what strikes me, though, Dean, is we've got Zack outlined, you know, there's a spectrum of kind of permissions that in the new world that we all have. They stop well short of what we, you know, have as an outline permission now. There are clearly good and bad outline permissions out there, but broadly they take you to a certain point along the value curve for landowners before appointing a development partner, because it de-risks the site. You know, a builder can take it off us, and they can know with some reliability just how long it's going to take them to get a reserve matters, which doesn't fight too much against the outlined principles that you've negotiated, and technical matters like you've outlined. So I suppose it's probably not one for now, but I just throw out there, we will have to all grapple as an industry to mimic almost an outline permission, so that we can take it past the automatic permission in principle on the back of an allocation, however front loaded that information was, and just fill those gaps to get it towards the spectrum of what we know as an outline now, because it goes to the heart of the land procurement in the country. House builders rely on that. They don't have, they're exceptionally capable businesses of promoting their own land as well, but they all, to varying degrees, rely on consented land too. Resource risk. The more land that they have to hold for planning mishaps, the less efficient a business that they have. The capital get tied up. So we need to give them things that they can reliably launch into, to building quickly. So I think that's one thing that probably just leave there for us to think about. The other aspect is there's definitely a theme of wanting SMEs to be back in the market. We talked very early in the introduction about some of the measures that the government are going to do in the short term to try and reinvigorate that part of the market. There is a risk that if you're not got a regular supply of consented land in the way that we currently know, it's an outline, well down the risk curve, then SMEs aren't able to kind of come in and plug into that land, as they need it. You've got, SMEs that setting up today, like your wife's just joined, a relatively new business. They don't have the benefit of many years of land investments where they can have bought the land through the system. They need to go out there and simply buy land and develop. And I do worry if we don't get it right, then we just won't have that status of permissions that we've got at the moment that have real value and a good staging point to go on to delivery. So it's no solutions there. I'm just kind of putting it out there as a potential problem. But I probably want to just kind of link in James really now. We've got in this brand new, brave world of front loading, dealing with everything up front. Everything's deliverable. Maybe that explains the probably, certainly a surprise for me, aspect of the white paper, which was the abolition of the 5-year supply requirement. Most people dialing in will know the importance of the 5-year supply and the role that it does at the moment. But I think the proposition is that so much of this work is going to be done up front, so many deliverable allocated sites that you're not going to need a 5-year supply. So is that realistic? And does it cause concern for you, James?
Thanks, Paul. This is a subject, of course, that most of us in the industry, when we saw the proposals in the white paper, were immediately concerned with because of the consequences it could have on the delivery of new homes. Just as a reminder to ourselves, of the 241,000 homes delivered last year, a significant proportion, 187,000, were delivered through local plans, the remainder of which were through other means such as windfall allowances, change of use applications and planning appeals. So as a proportion of overall delivery, the number of permissions and new homes delivered via appeal is relatively low. So the perception in some quarters that land promoters and developers are opportunistic to the system is the wrong one, because for the most part, permissions come through the local plan route. However, that doesn't really tell the whole story. And whilst permissions obtained via appeal are not a high proportion of the overall number, the current requirement for local authorities to maintain an up-to-date 5-year housing land supply, in my view, is critical to overall delivery. This is particularly relevant in areas that are not constrained by restrictive policies such as Greenbelt and AONB, where the requirement to maintain an up-to-date 5-year housing land supply has been and remains a principal factor in governing the behaviour of local authorities and, perhaps more importantly, their elected members to aid delivery. This is because these authorities and their political representatives know that if they don't maintain an up-to-date supply through making sure they've got a local plan in place or they're positively determining planning applications, that ultimately they're going to be susceptible to speculative applications on sites and locations that they perhaps don't favour, so they tend to get on with the job. In fact, in 2010, prior to the introduction of the National Planning Policy Framework, which came in 2012, only 17% of local authorities had a local plan in place. That figure today stands at around 90%. The significant factor behind this being that the 2012 framework introduced the principle of the presumption in favour of sustainable development and the tilted balance that would be triggered through the lack of an up-to-date 5-year housing land supply. So we can see this was a real stick really to getting local authorities to progress with the plan making, because otherwise they were going to be susceptible to speculative applications. The current system though, in my view, is far from perfect, and a significant proportion of local authorities that fall within the 10% that I mentioned, i.e. the authorities that haven't got a local plan in place, are those that are largely constrained by Greenbelt. Unfortunately, a lack of 5-year housing land supply and the tilted balance in favour of sustainable development that's triggered doesn't trump Greenbelt policy in its own right. Housing need alone, outside of the local plan process, rarely allows development to come forwards on Greenbelt land, meaning the release of Greenbelt development generally has to come through the plan process. However, the key issue being that if these Greenbelt constrained authorities don't get their local plans in place, there isn't really a punishment because they're not susceptible to speculative unplanned development. This is really frustrating, and I think to my mind, and in answer to your question, gives a real insight into what we might expect by way of behaviour if the 5-year housing land supply test is removed. The Welsh planning system also provides a good example of this, where a couple of years ago the government almost overnight, through a written ministerial statement, effectively removed the requirement for its authorities to maintain a 5-year housing land supply. The consequence of this in many areas in Wales has been delayed local plans, a lack of delivery of homes on the ground, hitting those real people, not just numbers that we all can see on a piece of paper that come out, but those that are really in housing need. And it's quite sad really, because in the short term they really do face little prospect of getting a home. So
no, I totally agree with that. I mean, we've only got to look at some of the places that were more vulnerable to the 5-year supply.
Yeah.
Speculative applications, when the MPPF came out, we looked at Cheshire East, Stratford, there were authorities that held on to their moratoriums for far longer than they ever should have done.
Yeah.
When that got opened up, then, we all went and put applications in where we did. And, those are at the top of my mind, just because if you look at the housing delivery, there are probably 2 authorities that are providing phenomenally well. We drive around at any of those districts and there's all kinds of infrastructure being provided, housing sites everywhere, and they're delivering their plan requirements. A plan requirement, they always said that all of them in the local plan examination and appeals, that they'd never possibly make really. So you think, well, if either of those authorities, and I appreciate there is a bit of Greenbelt in both of those authorities to be fair, but if they were all Greenbelt authorities, then we'd have had thousands and thousands of homes and roads and schools that would have simply just not been delivered in the last 5-10 years, because the problem will be navigating about preparing a plan. So I do worry that if you don't have the mechanism, then it will change behavioural effects. But I suppose just playing devil's advocate, you are you do manage to get the new system to work. We do get all these deliverable sites. The amount of effort and time that goes into 5-year supply arguments up and down the country, then isn't the housing delivery test just as good a place to be when you wanted to keep these councils in check and deliver housing?
Well, it's definitely a good tool, Paul, in its own right for assessing a local authority's performance, and can avoid the theoretical analysis of housing land supply that's kept many of us busy over the last few years. However, there are questions for me in terms of how effective that it would be just standing on its own. I mean, firstly, the current consultation is unclear how the test will work going forwards, because at present, the test operates alongside 5-year supply, making authorities that have failed to deliver apply a 20% buffer, i.e. extra sites to its 5-year housing land supply, as a punishment and, more importantly, a way of boosting delivery in the short term. Additionally, the housing delivery test is really a measurement of past performance, assessing an authority's delivery over the previous 3 years, whereas 5-year housing land supply looks forward and importantly sets a delivery trajectory. In plan making terms, this means that local authorities in the current system have to think about shorter term sites as well as longer term ones. The current system isn't perfect, as we all know, as we've all seen local plans that seek to allocate large strategic sites that are difficult to deliver. However, perhaps a consequence of removing the housing land supply test and some of the things we've talked about earlier just might mean that authorities begin to allocate larger, complex sites that might be more difficult to deliver. I mean, add to this what the guys on the webinar have talked about earlier in terms of uncertainties around local plans effectively granting outline permission, then this could lead to less homes being delivered in real terms, in my view. And the white paper itself recognises that more permissions doesn't necessarily result in greater delivery, but at least with the supply test, it does provide an incentive and an ability to ensure shorter term delivery. I mean, theoretically, the delivery test that looks at and measures a local authority's past performance of delivery would eventually capture this and apply the tilted balance. However, the policy consequence of engaging the presumption, I just think, is unnecessarily delayed because it's just waiting for the problem to happen. It's just simply too late in the process.
You already hit the iceberg, haven't you, really?
Yeah, absolutely. And arguably by that point, the under-delivery is exacerbated far beyond what it needs to be, and even more difficult for the authority to then rectify because of the lead-in times involved. We all know that the point at which authorities start to consent development, you've got to go through the process, and really to the point you're actually delivering homes on the ground, you're a couple of years away. So there's 5 years worth of failure there potentially before anything happens. I mean, yeah. Jonathan Dodd of Turley, that some people may have read the recent article, described the 5-year supply requirement as a preventative medicine, with the housing delivery test, on the other hand, being reactive. I just thought that was quite apt analogy in the current environment.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the things, James, is that, I mean, we're going to come on to a little bit on local government reorganisation, but experience tells you when you've got, the planning reforms, that we've got any planning reform, anybody, running on the existing system might decide to pause and wait and use it as a bit of an excuse. We've got, we potentially, I mean, I know we're talking about the future planning system, but while we're on the housing supply situation, then, it's absolutely fundamental that it's kept in the short term. I mean, I still think it's fundamental that it's kept in the future system for all the reasons you've outlined. But in the short term, when we're faced with lots of plans drifting and all this reform on top of local government reorganisation, which can cause a massive distraction to plan making, because you get members more interested in how they're going to integrate the councils rather than the plan making. That may become kind of a far more prevalent kind of route through to permissions if we want to keep housing supply going. We're already getting plenty of house builders telling us there's an acute shortage of land in certain regions. A lot of the West Midlands, people are crying out for land in the East Midlands as well. So I mean, we remain on our toes, I think, don't we, to opportune that. But I'm mindful of time, so and we've got some questions coming as well, which actually do merge into the topics I wanted to cover, and we absolutely can't leave this unclear, really. And we've got a question about the affordable housing, and is it going to be now become a developer choice? I think that's probably someone looking at the infrastructure levy and how that works, and I think that's probably one for Zack, if you don't mind. Just how's this going to work with Section 106 and affordable and still at the moment? What we're looking at?
If only I knew. So what are we looking at? So it's a whole other limb of the white paper relates to the infrastructure levy that Paul's just referred to. The idea is that, particularly just with a focus on affordable housing, of course 106 agreements and SIL cover all sorts of things that have nothing to do with affordable housing, but just zooming in for a moment on affordable housing, the idea is that affordable housing levied through this centrally set tariff. So it's another example of sort of the powers, as it were, being hoovered back up into central government. That will be distributed to all LPAs, who then, and the tax, and it's now being referred to as a tax, it's a tax on occupation. So there's a certainty to how much you'll be paying, how much you'll be contributing towards affordable housing. How all that's going to work will be clear up front, and it's payable on occupation. We don't know how the rates are going to be set yet. All of that's TBD. But what's really important, and a point that Paul alluded to, is what about on-site affordable delivery? Well, what the white paper moots is that what you can do, I say what you can do, what can be done, is to offset, you know, your any on-site affordable delivery against having to pay this levy, which in principle all sounds very, you know, sensible. So far, so good. Kind of familiar to the principles that we're used to in terms of how we negotiate on-site delivery of affordable versus off-site payments in certain circumstances at the moment. The really important thing that's not clear, that again Paul alluded to, is who decides and how. So, for example, could you, if you're promoting the site as the developer, make the decision we're doing our affordable on site, or is it the council's choice, and how and when is that decision taken? How's it communicated to you? All of that stuff. Really important, of course, because it might make an enormous difference to the sort of scheme that you end up bringing forward, to the contours of it, the shape of it, the density, the scale, all of that. So unfortunately, Paul, the answer is it's a big old question mark at the moment as to who makes those really important decisions.
Yeah, but I mean, just outlining a scenario where it could be paid for off-site, and you know the whole the scheme then becomes private market. You know, it has such a profound difference to the developers, you know, business approach really, because you've got
absolutely.
They hold a certain amount of land. You know, they're assuming they're going to get affordable. They have HA partners. They often golden brick, get some cash flow into the scheme.
Yeah.
They, sales rates increase, as Letwin, you know, covered in his report. The more variety of tenures that you have, the more that you speed up delivery.
Yeah.
It's so profound because, you know, these house builders, you know, they don't look to hold any more than, you know, 4 years maybe owned and controlled land. Yeah. If you were to remove affordable housing out of it and make a contribution, presumably because these new unitary authorities might want to go and embarking on a whole new revolution and council house building, who knows?
But
it does need clarity, doesn't it?
I couldn't agree more. It's one of a sort of ever-growing list of genuinely sort of profound and important questions that go to the heart of what this system looks like. I mean, another one that's linked to it, because it goes to the certainty with which sort of developers and the house building industry can approach this new plan making system, is, you know, it links to what James was talking about. Okay, you know, the proposal is to ditch 5-year housing land supply, and okay, as Paul said, the sort of logic behind that is purported to be that, well, we're going to have new plans. They're going to have fixed housing numbers, which we've talked about already. They're going to be legally required to be in place, and they're going to be legally required to be updated every few years. So because of all of that regular updating, the fact that it's all there from the ops, all the front loading that Haydn's talked about already, there's no need for a 5-year housing land supply requirement. It would be OTOs, unnecessary. That's the proposition.
Yeah.
Okay, but with a fair wind, you can see how that logic might fit together. But what when it doesn't? What when the wind is not fair, and when plan making starts to be delayed, as we know it can be, and in some authorities, obviously, it's been delayed by many decades now. But putting them aside, more pragmatically, if you go along to a local plan examination and the inspector's looking at an area on a map that says growth or renewal or whatever, and it's got some density parameters on it, say between 30 to 40 dwellings per hectare, whatever it is, but you've not yet got the detailed master plan sorted, which you won't necessarily have to. See the discussion we've been having already. You've not yet got the affordable provision decided. Is it on site? Is it off site? How does that affect the scheme? All these questions of detail, all for later. How do you know how many units your growth zone or your renewal zone is actually going to deliver? And if you don't know how many units they're going to deliver, which at the moment I can't see how one can sort of do that bit of maths, but the inspectors examining the plans will have to. If you can't work it out, then how can you tell whether or not this is a plan that's actually going to deliver these centrally imposed targets? And I think your point, Paul, about the uncertainty over affordable and how it's actually going to work goes right to the heart of that sort of uncertainty, the difficulty that we'll all face in actually trying to examine these plans and to test them, see are they going to meet their needs or not.
Sure. I've got another question coming related to the infrastructure levy as well, and someone suggesting that is it land value capture through the back door. As far as I understand it, the levy, the infrastructure levy, will be based on the GDV of the site and when plots are sold. So big benefit for cash flowing for the house builder, return on capital, not having to spend a huge amount of money on contributions up front, but when they deliver the actual house. But of course, it does, by being linked to GDV and allegedly centrally set, then one does think that could therefore attach a greater level of contribution from a site down in Surrey, say, than if you up in Halifax. Not picking on either of those for any reason, but they're clearly diametrically opposed on the value scale. So if we're talking about a centrally kind of imposed target, which may be right there, then it cuts across again at the levelling up, doesn't it? Because you're going to have all the development down south having an abundance of money collected for infrastructure and very little up north, and it might bear no resemblance at all or reflection on what's actually needed. And we've been to a system of only providing what's necessary to make the development acceptable. It seems to me, if you need a school place up in Halifax or a school place down in Surrey, well, there shouldn't necessarily be a difference in that contribution. The provision should be the same. So I think there's some major kind of clarifications that's needed on that aspect as well.
Agree. I agree. And the only thing I'd add to that, all of which I agree with, Paul, is that I'm not so sure if it is land value capture, it's happening by the back door. I think it might be by the front door. If it's all over the white paper, references to previous government reports on land value capture. They've been thinking about this for a while. How can they affect it? How can they bring it about? And all of the things you say, Paul, are right. This is what's being proposed, and it has some real challenges, among other things, for levelling up.
I think it's just important to mention at that point as well, just, the complexities of just bringing some of these uncertain elements in. When the government brought community infrastructure levy in, the intention was to try and simplify the system. 10 years later, and quite a lot of complexity and law. So I think that's just going to be, an interesting thing. And I think just an observation generally of some of the proposals in the white paper for me are that it seems like there's opportunities in there, but there's also risks. And obviously I've been talking about 5-year supply and the housing delivery test. And I think 5-year supply has been a tried and tested way, as we talked about, of getting local authorities to act really and to get local plans in place. And I think just one observation for me is that there's a lot of uncertainty, and just taking a minor point of, say, the housing or one of the points of bringing the housing delivery test in, they're effectively dropping something that's proven in 5-year supply and replacing it with a test that actually, I haven't got the exact figures here, but if you look at what the housing delivery test has actually delivered, because of the way in which it's, had a phased operational entrance into the system, then it's quite a big risk, isn't it, really? So, that's just one of my observations.
Yeah, hopefully common sense will prevail. We've got another question here. We managed to go all this way without talking about Greenbelt. There's been a few references in the beginning about baking in the constraints and so on, but we've got a government with an 80 majority, and apparently on every speech that they do and paper, they acknowledge the generational injustices of home ownership and meeting housing where the demand is. How you can call something as radical as it's ever been since the Second World War, and not have a more grown-up conversation about Greenbelt. I don't know, it's beggars belief. Maybe I am naive and thinking that we could ever speak about that without it all going crazy. But Zach, there's absolutely no sign of any softening there, is there?
Nothing at all. And it is remarkable, really, because I mean, it remains the elephant in the room. It remains the most sort of obvious and pressing challenge. I talked earlier on about comparing the two plans, the one showing where a house is needed and the other showing where they actually might go. You take a county like Surrey, which one I was looking at earlier this week, enormous planned growth in Surrey through the OAN, or the local housing number. Because houses are needed in Surrey, because it's a sensible place to put houses, because you've obviously got very good sustainable train links into London and all the rest of it. Great place to build on the face of it. Now the numbers are high, but then when you overlay Surrey with the Greenbelt map and then the Surrey Hills AONB map, there's nowhere to put any of those houses. And reconciling that basically intractable dispute remains at the heart of every, it's really at the heart of what we're talking about. And it's been that way for decades. Greenbelt policy remains the third rail, the one thing that government after government of every colour simply will not touch. And it's remained more or less in the form that it is now since the mid-1950s. Literally, and we remain with the metropolitan Greenbelt around London on its own is twice the size of Luxembourg and larger than Trinidad and Tobago, and there's no sign, Paul, of anything resembling what some of us might call a sort of grown-up discussion about reform to the way that we look at building in the Greenbelt.
It was about 6 months ago. We were the Richborough guys were sat down and put our top 5 list of things that we think should be done, and remarkably, I think number 2, we actually just said rebrand the Greenbelt. It didn't have green in it. It's almost
totally
policy, like calling it green. If they'd have only called it something like the area of restraint,
they should have called it an urban containment zone, because that's what the idea actually was. It had nothing to do with being green, and it's not a belt either, so it's a misnomer in the extreme. I agree.
I mean, it just rebranding it might allow the next plan, the next set of reforms to look at it with a little less loaded emotion, really. Every article we see, Telegraph, a picture of a Greenbelt is rarely the boring kind of sometimes dirty, horrible field next to an urban town. It's a beautiful think kind of national park or something. It's hard to break that kind of psychological link of Greenbelt and prettiness, really, isn't it?
I think it's really an enormous challenge, genuinely. I mean, I'm chuckling because of what you're saying, but it really is. And breaking that link, the assumption that Greenbelt's got something to do with the sort of the quality of our green and pleasant land from a landscape and visual point of view. We're nowhere. We don't seem to be getting any closer to really confronting that and explaining to people, what Greenbelt's actually there for. And sure, it's got functions, and there are certain areas of land that we want to be maintaining those functions. But it's this kind of almost sort of like a religious approach to it that makes conversations on it so toxic, and obviously the toxic enough that this government, just like all of its predecessors, have decided not to go there.
I think we've got time for one more question. I'll take the specificness out of it, but I'll turn it into a more generic point. But it's a landowner that's got a site, a draft allocation in an early stage plan, and is looking over at the reform, local government reform. Are these plans likely to continue, or are they going to be derailed by local government reorganisation? I think I'll probably put it to you, Haydn, if you don't mind, because we've got experience, haven't we, in parts of the country where we've had this reorganisation, and perhaps you could kind of just give your view of how it might play out.
I think that it will literally depend on where the plan is at the stage the reorganisation takes place, and you refer there to a landowner with an early stage allocation, then that may well find that, I mean, perhaps it's a little bit early now, but if it was a year or two down the line, might find that plan is cut off, and the unitary authority, they start preparing a new one. You mentioned, Cheshire East before, and we were involved as Richborough in Cheshire East before it was Cheshire East. And we were part of the beginning of the preparation of the Congleton Borough local plan that they called a halt to it and back to the drawing board and start again. We've got a situation in Dorset where there are 2 new unitaries there, and the one set of unitaries, 3 or 4 plans there have been stopped and starting again. So I think it does depend where you are. If you're already at examination, I can't see that they pull the plug on a plan then at that stage. But it does get messy, doesn't it? Because you're almost operating, a sort of an emerging plan, but somebody's got an adopted plan and it covers the same sort of area. So, but I think it will depend on where we are at the time of a unitary authority, as to whether your allocation sticks. And then the other thing with unitaries, I think, or at the moment, you can start off with some districts where there's some market towns and they're all top tier settlements because they're market towns. But if you end up in a unitary with a much bigger settlement, all of a sudden your market towns are tier 2 or maybe even tier 3. And that's, so you might think, wow, tier 3, tier 1 site, settlement, brilliant. That's a nail on allocation there. You might find reorganisation, if you're still in the plan, you're further down the settlement hierarchy, and that might mean less sites there or less numbers. So, again,
actually, I mean, the mind boggles as to all the different permutations. But we're in local authorities, aren't we, where half of it is greenbelt, half of it is not, and the strategy is an anything but greenbelt strategy, which delivers some perverse consequences of travel patterns and so on. But you could end up with a situation when you're merging 3, 4, 5, 6 authorities. Some of that are wholly greenbelt, which if they progress their plans, then you would reasonably expect that you would see some greenbelt allocations. But you now get them married with a non-greenbelt authority, and the options there are you put all your numbers in that particular authority. Now that's going to be good or bad depending on which side of the equation that landowner sits. And I'm not sure, but it's probably not one with an eye on the clock. I'll just leave that as a thought, really, that these things can throw up difficulties. But with unitaries, the positive side of it is that you should have a better resourced authority. You should have joined up thinking with infrastructure and where housing goes. You should be able to deal with larger than local issues, which is what a lot of the plans have been fallen down on with duty to cooperate, which I think if I passed it over to you now, that would probably go on for too long, more than we've got. But I think, glass half full, it has to be a good thing. It's just whether or not we're biting off more than we can chew, along with some pretty serious reforms.
Yeah, I think that's possibly the problem, isn't it? I mean, there's a unitary authority. There's a lot more to a unitary authority than just planning, but it's almost 2 big whammies of reforms that we believe potentially are all by the end of this Parliament. I think that's the thinking at the moment, and that's it's quite a big disruption to the system.
Yeah. So with an eye on the clock, we have got to wrap things up, and we've covered a lot of ground there. I think it's fair to say that calling the paper a white paper might be a little bit of a misdescription. It's got lots of good ideas in there. The more you kick the idea around, the more you realise it needs a little bit more meat on it. But we can't be fearful of change. We've got to kind of give it a fair hearing, and it will be what it will be. But we've got a lot of work to do to frame our representations, which are coming up very soon at the end of October. We're working on those with the LPDF. We're looking at them ourselves. We're speaking to landowners. I think they've got to be constructive, feedback. You've got to kind of not just try and look at why every element of it is wrong, but probably just frame it that, well, if you want this to work, then you probably got to think about this, and probably outline some of the pitfalls. But change can sometimes present opportunity. They could make a in a positive way, in a negative way, they could make a hash of it, and we're back to more speculative applications, or they make a real good case of it, and we've got more houses to allocate, more sites to allocate, and we've got a speeded up system. So I think it's just being on our toes, really, isn't it? And what will be, and we've just got to be adaptable with it, I think. So I think all that leaves really is to thank you for joining us, and thank you for the panelists. Really appreciate the time. And if any of you have got any pressing questions afterwards, then just direct them to us, and we'll try and follow that up. So thank you, and have a good evening.